It's absolutely clear. There's never been any doubt that this war will end at the negotiating table. There's no other way it can end, because the only other way that wars do end is with complete victory for one or the other side.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. My name is Lisa Hazeldine, and today I'm joined by the Russia expert and journalist Owen Matthews to discuss Ukraine's desire to join NATO. In this week's magazine, Owen wrote about just that and whether or not Ukraine joining NATO is a realistic prospect. Owen, thank you so much for joining me today. Reports have emerged over the weekend that North Korea has sent approximately 12,000 soldiers to Russia with the idea that they're going to be training alongside Russian troops and eventually joining them on the front in Ukraine. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on this topic, and also whether or not this should be considered an escalation in the war with Ukraine.
If it happens, if it's true, then that might be considered an escalation. But even Keir Starmer said he's seen the reports and he refused to confirm or deny. So at the moment, I think all I've seen is some very amateurish footage of soldiers who are supposedly who are actually Koreans, but who sort of seem to speak fluent Ukrainian. I mean, some people have been putting out, that these are like Ukrainians, the Koreans that are supposedly being captured on the front lines. I'm not sure at what level of Ukrainian psyops those videos have been taken, but they're very poorly done. So I think at a very low level. I'll believe it when I see it, and I think I wonder whether North Korean troops are of particular value. One of the reports that have come through is that they are highly trained North Korean special forces, which is interesting. Although, once again, in the context of the kind of war that Russia is fighting in Donbass at the moment, which is just sort of grinding advances through very heavy artillery barrages and so on. I wonder whether those high-quality special forces troops are the kind of troops that are going to get Russia very far. But anyway, it's so far there's actually been very little proof that any of this is true.
Could you take us through, perhaps as a starting point, exactly why Russia is so opposed to the idea of Ukraine gaining NATO membership, and why exactly for Russia they view this as an existential threat?
Well, it's the same reason why, for instance, John F. Kennedy viewed potential communist control over the island of Cuba and the stationing of Soviet missiles there to be an existential threat to the security of the United States. It's the same reason why successive American administrations throughout the Cold War in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s viewed communist control over Central American countries as an existential threat. It's the same reason why China views military any kind of military alliance on behalf of Taiwan, or even actual statehood on behalf of Taiwan, to be an existential threat. It's because of geography. It's very simple. From Putin's point of view, he believes that enormous 1,900-kilometer basically unnatural border, it's just a line drawn on a map, that between Ukraine and Russia is vulnerable. And it's a vital question of Russia's national security, in Putin's estimation, that Ukraine remain neutral. And it's been very interesting to compare the reaction of the Kremlin to NATO states joining the Baltic states joining NATO, which was Russia protested, but ultimately it was swallowed. And most recently, you have Finland and Sweden, who had been formerly neutral, joining NATO, which they also basically didn't demur about at all. I mean, they didn't really regard those parts of NATO expansion as a particularly existential threat. But Ukraine, I think, is in a different category, and it's always been in a different category. And even if you go back to, for instance, like WikiLeaks, of the cables of then Ambassador William Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, but in the early 2000s, he was U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he wrote in the cable back in 2007, whatever the political stripe, from knuckle-dragging communists to Western liberals, there is no Russian politician that does not see Ukrainian membership of NATO as like the reddest of red lines. So it's not even just Putin's idea. I mean, this goes right back to Yeltsin. It's something that the Russians take very, very seriously, that the membership of this country, which they regard as their strategic underbelly, is something that they are not prepared to countenance. That's Putin's logic, and it doesn't differ all that much from the logic of America and China over the last decades.
It's interesting that you bring up this question of red lines, because that's a narrative that we've heard pretty much consistently throughout this conflict in Ukraine, and actually before that as well. And on the one hand, as you say, there are those who sort of believe that giving Ukraine NATO membership would be crossing this enormous red line for Putin. And yet there seem to have, particularly over the past 2.5 years or so, there have been plenty of times when there have been fears about breaching a red line and how Putin might retaliate. And often those fears haven't quite always come to pass as people expect. Russia's reaction, Putin's response, has been either underwhelming or somewhat muted. So I was just wondering why it is that exactly this red line is something that is so much, I suppose, firmer than others in the past.
Well, I mean, the deeper question is whether you think NATO membership is the solution to Ukraine's problems or the cause of Ukraine's problems. Because, and people tend to forget that between 2010 and 2015, Ukraine was constitutionally neutral, in fact, by law. And support in Ukraine for NATO membership has actually not, until this war, actually ever really been an overwhelming majority. The point is that many Ukrainians will say, including Zelensky, will argue that NATO membership is the only way to provide security guarantees to keep Russia at bay in the future. But the point, I make 2 points in my article this week. One of them is that regardless of whether it's a good idea or not, Ukrainian membership of NATO is legally and politically impossible. So in that sense, it's completely irresponsible and stupid to even discuss the possibility. And I'll explain. I mean, legally impossible because the NATO Charter forbids any country with disputed borders from joining NATO. And no countries currently have more hotly disputed borders than Ukraine. It's literally a country at war over its borders. And there are sort of potential workarounds that have been suggested. So, for instance, West Germany had disputed borders. It didn't recognize East Germany, but nonetheless, there was a sort of constitutional workaround that allowed West Germany to be part of NATO. But fundamentally, and perhaps more importantly than the legal issue, is the fact that unanimity requires the Germans to sign off on NATO membership. There's, for Ukraine, there's very strong skepticism there. The Hungarians, the Turks, and the Americans, which are profoundly divided over this. So Ukraine, unfortunately, finds itself in the worst of all possible worlds. In that, they're constantly talking about the possibility of NATO membership, and that is obviously, like a red rag to the bull for Putin, but without the prospect of actually getting it. And I'm not saying that things that are red rags to a bull of Putin should not be done, but I'm just saying if it's not actually possible to do it, why are we even talking about it? Because what we are talking about is security guarantees for Ukraine that are something less than NATO, but something more than a thing called the Budapest Memorandum that was signed in 1994 to guarantee Ukrainian borders in exchange for it giving up its nuclear weapons. So it's going to be, security guarantees from the West that are greater than the Budapest Memorandum, but lesser than NATO. And I think ultimately the only difference between those two positions is the word NATO. The security guarantees are going to happen. NATO membership isn't. So why are we even framing it in the terms of NATO membership? Because actually, that is the one thing that Putin cannot possibly allow, and he will continue fighting as long as NATO as NATO continues to be on the table. And that means that in fact the war is continuing, and thousands of young Ukrainians are dying, and young Russians are dying, just for the sake of a sort of semantic argument.
I think nonetheless, though, there will be some viewers watching this who might sort of feel a little bit frustrated, I suppose, by the idea that NATO membership for Ukraine can never happen and isn't something that's even worth discussing. What would you say to those people then who believe that essentially to write the idea of Ukraine joining NATO off as appeasement, who kind of are of the view that we should be supporting Ukraine as much as possible, we should be sending them aid and granting them membership to NATO because they're not just fighting this war for themselves, but also for sort of the rest of Europe, the sort of in the name of peace, as it were?
Well, it depends whether your concern is actually for Ukraine's security or for some sort of ideological idea of sort of the West's security architecture. Because if actually your primary concern is how to keep Ukraine safe and how to contain the war and stop more people from being killed and make sure that that Putin does not have a further casus belli to restart the war, I would argue that actually Ukraine being neutral but strongly guaranteed by the West is actually a much safer position for Ukraine than NATO membership. NATO membership is like a standing provocation to Putin and will make ultimately Ukraine less safe rather than more safe. People who say that we are fighting Putin in Ukraine so we don't have to fight him in Warsaw and so on, I find that logic very strange because if you think that Putin is an inveterate imperialist, then that argument holds water. If you think that his aim is to completely conquer all of Ukraine and restore the Soviet Empire, then the argument holds water. But I don't think it actually is true. I mean, Putin, I think, is more of an ethno-nationalist than he is an imperialist. And that sounds like a sort of, abstruse international relations kind of jargon, but actually it's a very important distinction. Because the one quote that everyone knows from Putin is the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Now, that's the second half of a longer sentence. So what Putin actually said in November 2005 when he's addressing the Russian parliament is he said, for the millions of Russians who found themselves outside the borders of their motherland, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Now, that's a really importantly different thought. And he's fighting this war notionally, not just to prevent NATO from Ukraine from joining NATO, but notionally in Putin's mind, his casus belli is to save people who he doesn't actually consider to be Ukrainians, i.e. the Russian speakers of Eastern Ukraine, from supposed oppression. Now, we happen to know that that's actually untrue. There was discontent in Eastern Ukraine. It would definitely not have spilled into civil war, much less into serious separatism without Russian involvement. But nonetheless, I think that Putin's strategic aims are actually much more about defending Russia and the supposedly vital interest that he has in maintaining a neutral Ukraine rather than actually imperial reconquest, not least because it's clearly beyond his capabilities. I mean, his army has been fought to a standstill, having taken 22% of Ukraine to a near standstill, not by NATO. NATO hasn't shown up yet. NATO are not directly involved, but by the Ukrainian army. It took him 10 months to take Avdiivka, and he lost nearly 10,000 casualties. That was as many as the Soviet Union lost in an 8-year war in Afghanistan to take Avdiivka, being this little tiny, insignificant town. Why do we think if he can't take Avdiivka, it takes him nearly a year to take a little town in Donbass? Do we think that Vilnius or Warsaw that are covered by a NATO umbrella are going to be next? I think that's completely unrealistic.
Looking forward to the next few months, you mentioned in your piece the idea of upcoming peace negotiations for Ukraine at some point in the near future. So I was just wondering, when do you think those peace negotiations might be likely to take place, and how do you think Ukraine might respond to being asked to consider letting go of their desire to join NATO one day as part of that?
Concerning when the negotiations will take place, I mean, it's absolutely clear. There's never been any doubt that this war will end at the negotiating table. There's no other way it can end, because the only other way that wars do end is with complete victory for one or the other side. And clearly, Ukraine is not about to occupy Moscow or destroy the Putin regime or sort of march in a march into Red Square anytime. So it's going to be the negotiating table. When that happens is, unfortunately, it's when Putin thinks that the costs of the war outweigh the benefits. And unfortunately, again, at the moment, the vector of the war is going in Putin's favor. He's actually sort of stabilized the budget and he stabilized his military machine and actually has the capacity to fight on should he wish to. And that's a really sad and terrible situation for Ukraine, because I think Ukraine is much more vulnerable militarily and politically than Russia is. So the short answer is, when Putin decides to do that, and I don't really see a viable compellence strategy for forcing him to do that, unless perhaps there are more long-range strikes inside Russia by Ukrainian missiles, but not by NATO missiles, because I think NATO missiles is actually going to be incredibly escalatory and actually is going to, one of the things that is going to keep Putin away from the negotiation table is the continued occupation of Russian territory, like the Kursk incursion, and the actual direct involvement, as he sees it, of NATO weaponry, actually hitting Russian targets. I think those are things, that are going to actually keep Putin away from the negotiating table. As opposed, when it comes to the question of NATO membership and Ukraine signing away NATO membership, they've already conceded that. They already conceded it in March and April during talks of 2022 in talks in Istanbul. And I've spoken personally at great length to three of the Ukrainian negotiators who were at the table: David Arasamia, Mikhailo Podolyak, and Alexei Arestovich. Clearly, that they were willing to surrender the prospect of NATO membership and acknowledge their neutrality in exchange for something big. So it's not that they want to, that they're happy to give it away, but they're not happy to give it away cheaply. And they want that to be like more or less the only thing they give away. And the one thing that is impossible for the Ukrainians to give away is de jure, in other legally, giving away their land. Not a single inch of territory will change hands, I believe, in a final negotiation. There's going to be a partition along the line of control, wherever that will be. But the Ukrainians cannot, legally sign away those territories, because Ukraine will instantly become ungovernable. And there's a really serious problem, is that a nationalist backlash against any kind of deal. Already a sort of de facto acknowledgement, like freezing the conflict, leaving those lands in the hands of the Russians, which I think is inevitable, without legally acknowledging that they're lost. Even that is going to be a step too far for many of Ukraine's ultra-nationalists, and that's a really big danger. So from the Ukrainian side, I think that's the biggest jeopardy in terms of negotiations. But right now, it's entirely hypothetical, because Putin has to decide that that he's ready, and he has to decide that the war is, that he's not going to get any more out of it, and it's too costly to continue.
Owen, thank you so much for joining me on Spectator TV, and thank you very much for watching.
My pleasure.